colloquium, Wednesday colloquium, until Deborah supposed to come in as well. We'll have a short round of introduction. Denard, start with you.
Hello, I'm Denard, and I have a legal background, and I'm also a PhD fellow here at Minerva Center.
Name?
Zacharia.
My name is Ken, and originally I'm from Shanghai, from China, but I'm a German citizen. I'm a PhD student from Italy and also Minerva Center.
I'm Michal, I'm the coordinator of the center.
I'm Matthias, also postdoc fellow at the Denard Center in Linguistics and Internet Studies.
Nadav, postdoctoral fellow here at the center.
Ronen, also postdoctoral fellow.
Katharina, I'm a PhD candidate at the Minerva Center for German European Studies and part of the Young Minerva Forum.
I think somebody is joining us. My name is Michael Voller. I'm connected to Maastricht University and to the Erasmus University Rotterdam. I am teaching here now for 2 weeks in law and economics. I know Adi, I think, for almost 25 years. We're both active in the European Association of Law and Economics, both the old guys from law and economics. And in Rotterdam, I'm the director of the European Doctorate of Law and Economics, in which these two gentlemen are doing their PhD.
And you are also cost supervisor.
Absolutely, I forgot that. The most important was today, yes. Adi and I are supervisors of them.
So we are happy to have Denard with us, not for the first time,
No.
second time, I think. Third time in the Minerva Center, but there are some new faces, and Denard works on asylum law from international law perspective, European law perspective, municipal law perspective, and of course from law and economics methodology. The floor is yours, about 35-40 minutes presentation, so we can open for a discussion and debate.
Okay. Dear Minerva colleague, dear Eli, dear Michael, תודה שהזמנת אותי ואתה לי את ההזדמנות להציג את המחקר שליבנו זה דיני פליטים. תמיד כיף לבקר בחיפה שוב. I'm Denard and I have a legal background. My presentation will be divided in 2 parts. In the first part, I will try to give you a general overview of my current project. And then in the second part, I will focus into details in the last chapter of this project, in particularly in EU regulatory competition in asylum law. And this second part is based on the paper that Professor Michael Faurer has written in environmental law. However, I have written about refugees, but the structure is similar with the work that Professor Faurer has done. So let's start with the first part. So in the first chapter, I have explained that although the 1951 Convention has applied a human rights approach, there are several parts of it who can also be explained through a law and economic approach. Therefore, for that reason, these 2 different approaches are not mutually exclusive, and they can still survive with each other. Followed by the other chapter, where I have focused into which are the main reasons to ratify and then to comply with the 1951 Convention. Regarding the reasons to ratify this convention, basically the state after World War II tried to avoid the war costs, and for that reason, when you have future uncertainty, especially under the concept of veil of ignorance for law and economics, it's much better to cooperate rather than to not cooperate. Then regarding the second part, so which are the main factors that push countries to comply with the 1951 Convention, the main reason are the reputation costs. So basically, though countries would like to be free riders and to not comply with the 1951 Convention, and from an economic terms, it's much better to not comply compared to comply with the 1951 Convention, still countries comply because if a decision of a country is going to impact in other countries, and therefore for that reason, in order to avoid negative externalities, they are going to comply with the 1951 Convention. Here in this chapter, I have analyzed some of the main variables that are going to impact into the refugee decision-making in order to leave, to flee, and then to decide which is the final destination country that they would like to reside. I will immediately have to say that just for exposition purposes, I have shown this in different variables and sub-variables that are impacting the main variables. Therefore, for that reason, these variables are not independent from each other, first of all. And second, these categories are not mutually exclusive. Then the fourth chapter deals with the impact of refugee flows in the host countries. What I did here, I tried to apply a nominalistic approach. I tried to focus in all the empirical studies that have been done until now. And I saw which is the impact the refugees have into the national labor market and national security. Regarding the national market, the studies state that refugees do not negatively impact or positively impact into the labor market. Then, regarding the connection between refugees and crimes, I divided them in different type of crime. I focused in three of them: in property crime, in violence crime, and also in terrorism acts. So now, regarding violent crimes, there is no connection at all. And this is also coherence with the Becker model. So basically, you commit a crime if the opportunity to be caught plus the utility taken from the illegal act is higher than the legal opportunities that you have. Then, regarding property crime, there is a positive effect, because in case that you are illegal, obviously you have to survive, and therefore for that reason you are going to commit property crimes. Then, regarding terrorism, I checked.
This is empirical findings, or
These are
theoretical?
literature review.
Okay,
This is just literature review.
but of empirical findings.
Yeah, of empirical findings. Yeah. So now, regarding the third one, the terrorist impact, so which is the impact the refugees have into the terrorist acts, I found two different empirical papers. And one of them was stating that, yes, it's true that refugees negatively impact into the terrorists by increasing the terrorist acts, while the other paper was basically a theoretical paper that was criticizing the empirical paper for the methodology that had applied in order to achieve that result.
Where were the empirical data taken from? Which...
No, I just did a literature review of the empirical data that the others have done.
But in which
So
countries? Or...
regarding the terrorism one, basically, if there were several papers, but if we focus into the area of Middle East, there is a positive connection. However, the paper in the Middle East could not be applied for general conclusions, because the area of Middle East is quite particular. So therefore, for that reason, when I stated two main studies, I spoke about studies that have a global data, not only about Middle East, because the papers that focus only into Middle East say, yes, refugees have a negative impact in terrorist acts. Higher is the refugee population, higher is the probability that you are going to have terrorism acts. But this is about Middle East, rather than the...
About refugees from the Middle East, or Middle East countries that are accepting refugees?
Both. refugees, because basically the paper was speaking about Palestinian refugees who went in Syria, and in Syria they they were one of the main causes that the civil war started there. Syria, yeah, Syria or Jordan, but I think Syria. Yeah, I can
Okay.
send you the paper
Sure.
later.
No,
Okay.
Sorry.
Okay. So now let's start with the second part, which is basically EU regulatory competition in asylum law. So in this part, I have considered the T-boot model, the problem of race to the top, the reduction of transaction cost, and then the importance of protection of human rights. So starting with the first factor, for the T-boot argument. So for who is not aware of T-boot argument, the idea is that in case that we have two communities and there is only fund to build, I don't know, to build a stadium or to build a theater, the lawmaker, the local lawmaker, is going to decide for the majority of the preferences of that community, and the minority of that community is going to go to the other community. So basically, the T-boot argument is stating that decentralization has the positive advantage in order that there is a heterogeneous preferences, and this give positive political results. Except that there are so importance of evolutionary efficiency, generating a learning process, and speeding to modify rules which are considered inefficient. In simple words, the idea of decentralization and competition between legal systems is that if they compete, there will be a kind of Darwin evolution, and therefore only rules that are efficient will survive, and then the rules that are inefficient basically will not survive. And this is also good because it's one of the main arguments that is used by comparative law and economics when they try to copy or to analyze the foreign law. Then the second part of this argument is that currently there are several EU law and especially directive and regulations such as the reception condition or asylum procedure or Dublin regulation, which focus into the minimum standards regarding the protection of refugees and the proceeding that they should have in order to become from a refugee to asylum migrants. Basically, one of the main arguments in order to have the competences in EU level is that this will avoid the coercion bargains. Basically, in simple words, the idea is that in case that there is externality, it shall be considered not only cost-benefit analysis, but also the feasibility of contractual agreement. So in case that there are some externalities, a supranational lawmaker can decide between complete decentralization, therefore doing nothing, complete centralization, therefore having total harmonization, or try to stipulate countries in order to have interstate agreement between each other in order to basically give opportunity that this externality is burdened by all the members and not only by group of these member states. So now, if the EU does not do anything and leaves everything to the countries, therefore leaving the opportunity of total decentralization, this will be disintegration. And therefore, this is not the best option. The second option, so if EU takes all the competences, so is a total harmonization, the problem will be remember the advantages of legal competition, competition between legal system. When I was speaking about the Tilburg argument, basically, in that case, the countries are going to lose the discretionality, and there will be also problems with sovereignty cost. So that is not the best option. Therefore, the third option is that an EU in a supranational level is going to incentivize the interstate agreements, and that basically happened in 2015 with the quota refugee. So now, one of the main arguments that EU has used in order to have the competences, especially in refugee law, is the fact that that argument that is called race to the top. So basically, the main idea is that in case that there is a neutral law, so a law that does not have moral or religious connection, and countries have the same, more or less, same or similar socioeconomic conditions, they are competing with each other in order to attract or to not attract something. In case of refugees, obviously, it's in order to not attract them. And this has been done in the last 20 years, which has been the possibility to have more and more restrictive policies. And this has given the policy overspill. And this has also given the opportunity of prisoner dilemma. Yeah.
Can I ask you a little thing in between? Was there a particular reason why you choose for the concept of race to the top rather than race to the bottom?
Yeah, that is actually one of the
Are the refugees the bottom or the top?
Yeah,
Or kicking them out?
that was actually a problem of deciding how to write, because in some papers it was written a race to the bottom when it was just speaking about the dilatory effect, so attracting the enterprises. Then when we were speaking about refugee, it was written race to the bottom, on the contrary. So therefore, race to the bottom, on the contrary, I said it's much better to make it shorter and do it race to the top. Because at the end of the day, what they are doing is basically increasing the standards in order to attract less refugees. So I could have called it race to the bottom, on the contrary, or race to the top directly. It's the same idea, but I preferred personally race to the top.
We'll have to discuss that at some moment. Yeah.
The question is and bottom from which perspective?
Correct.
From whose perspective?
From the
refugees'
No.
perspective or from
I'm speaking in the perspective of
the countries. Yeah.
countries, because countries are competing with each other in order to not attract them. In the case of race to the bottom, which is the Delaware idea, so they wanted to attract. So in this case, this to not attract. So that is why I stated race to the bottom on the contrary, or race to the top. So it's the same.
And then, just to be clear, is this for you now a theoretical story, or is this also empirical, that you say I'm describing what the European countries were engaged in?
This is basically a theoretical argument. So one of the main arguments in order to have EU competence is that this will totally eliminate, or depends. Then I'm going to speak about the two types of harmonization. So totally eliminate or decrease the competition between systems in order to not attract refugees. Okay, but the idea is it comes everything from
The idea, my understanding is that the race to the top is from the refugee perspective, because the restrictions are correlated to the race to the top. So in other words, if the state wants to restrict influx of immigrants to the state, it restricts the idea of race to the top. Because what is the idea? The idea is a refugee coming to the state, trying to acculture to the existing culture, trying to have employment, and to go up, to be socially mobilized from the bottom to the top. Now, if I'm anti-refugee, I put restriction on these on these refugees and on this race. Because the idea is that I want to go to the top. I want to achieve the top. This is my understanding. It's the perspective of the refugee himself or themselves. But
Okay,
you know,
these are really
let's leave it.
these are really definitional things which are not the main.
Of course, not the main, but you have to understand it because it goes, you know, all the way in the paper. I read the paper. It goes all the way. This item, race to the top, goes all the way your paper. And if we don't understand the idea and the restrictions that are, alongside them, we are, missing something very important. I think so. But
okay, so basically the idea is that everything comes from the competition between countries in order to attract or not to attract.
okay.
Then we can discuss if it's a race to the top, race to the bottom, or race to the bottom on the contrary. Okay, so let's move with the other argument, which is the reduction of transaction costs. This is extremely used in private law. However, in the recent years, is also being used in public law as well. The reduction of transaction cost is especially important in case of negative harmonization. So harmonization without the need of an international instrument. So basically the countries are harmonizing their own laws because they check that their law is the foreign law, is better than their own law. Therefore, they modify their own law in order to make it coherent. In these years, this is also kind of spontaneous harmonization. In these years, this spontaneous harmonization in asylum law did not work, and therefore, for that reason, for one of the main arguments for having EU competence in asylum law is also the reduction of transaction costs. Now, another argument for EU competence is the protection of human rights. So, EU started in 1957 as an economic, political, supranational organization. However, at the end of the 90s, immediately we have the idea of Europe with a human face. Now, if we focus into refugees, and especially if we see the Amsterdam Treaty, which for several people is considered as the reaction of Kosovo crisis, Article 73 K, which is currently the Article 78 of the Treaty of Functioning of the European Union, gives to the EU the competences in asylum law as well. And basically from not legally binding instruments in 2017, there are also legally binding instruments against the countries that did not comply with the quota refugee decided in 2015. So now, until now, I spoke which are the main arguments regarding to have an EU competence or not EU competence regarding refugee law. Now,
can I ask you one question? Because I also saw in your paper that later when you go to the application, you discuss the transboundary externalities argument, but it struck me that also here, in your theoretical presentation, the transboundary externalities is not mentioned. Does it mean that for you, theoretically, there is no transboundary externality issue?
The transboundary externality issue is just mentioned indirectly when I'm giving the conclusion in order to say that the argument does not work because the premises of the argument is that you shall have no externalities. And in the case of refugee protection, the protection of refugees is considered a negative externality. But I'm giving that only in this chapter is only indirectly touched, because in the chapter regarding the push factors is basically the main focus in that argument. Okay. Okay. So now there are two types of harmonization. Can be total harmonization or minimum standard harmonization. In case that there are big countries that are chosen by a lot of refugees, none of these two options is the best one. However, the minimum standard regime is better than the fixed standard regime because there is a higher number of refugees, first of all, and second, and even more important, states still have the opportunity to compete with each other. However, they cannot compete in order to go less than the minimum standard, but they can compete to attract the most interesting refugees or the most interesting persecuted people that they are interested. So now,
can I ask you a little question? When you talk about these minimum standards, do we have to see that in quantitative numbers, for example, number of refugees, or is it about quality of protection?
No. When I speak a minimum standard is regarding the law. Basically, shall the law speak about which are the minimum standards that each state shall guarantee, or the EU law shall state the minimum standards in order to guarantee, and then the countries can decide to give more rights than the one stated in the EU law. So is an analysis of the law rather than speaking about numbers, quantitative numbers or qualitative numbers into total number of refugees.
More rights?
More
to
rights.
Refugees, or different criteria that will accept more refugees? Two different things.
Is this one? Is the procedural aspect and the minimum requirements to accept refugees. This is the standards that is in the paper. It's more the procedure side.
It's definitely about the procedure side, but also is about the rights, because not in this chapter, but in the previous chapter, when I'm speaking about the protection of refugees, we have to take into consideration not only international law, but also EU law and also the national law. So connecting with this idea, for example, states such as Italy or Germany have a special category. If you do not enter into refugee or in the subsidiary protection, you can enter the category of Duldum in case of Germany, or protection of human rights in case of Italy. So it's also about the protection, but also about the rights, which means that each country cannot give less rights that the EU is establishing, because from an economic perspective, this is going to be considered like illegal, because one country gives less protection than the others, and basically is incorrectly having not a fair competition with other countries. So it is also connected with that, but it's also connected with the criteria as well. Okay. So now, regarding the conclusion, in the second part, I try to have to apply an economic analysis of principle of subsidiarity regarding the refugee protection. I try to consider some of the most important arguments regarding the centralization or decentralization of asylum law. So the main argument regarding the decentralization comes from Thibaut argument, and the premises of this argument is that there shall be a large number of suppliers, there shall be no information deficiencies, and shall be no externalities. So let's start in case of refugee, if all these requirements are fulfilled. There are a large number of legal rules. Yes, EU currently is 28. Maybe in the future will be 27. We don't know. Or maybe it will increase because Balkans will be part as well. Now, the second and the third requirement are not fulfilled. So let's start with the second one. basically, according to Tibut, it states that there shall not be information deficiencies. So now, according to the literature review of the empirical data, refugees have no information or have little information regarding the legal background of the final destination country, from one side. On the other side, countries by per se do not know all the preferences of all refugees, and therefore for that reason there is an information deficiency. Regarding the third requirement, as I was stating before, the protection of refugee rights is considered as a negative externality, and therefore for that reason the total decentralization cannot work in case of refugee. Now, let's check if total centralization can work. So basically, if giving everything to EU in case of refugee is the best option, this obviously will give as a positive effect the reduction of transaction costs, and obviously there will be an equalization of protection of refugee rights. So if these are the positive effects regarding the EU competence in refugee law, but the negative effects of the complete competence of the EU in case of asylum law is the fact that countries are going to lose discretionality, which for them is important, and also they are going to give a lot regarding their sovereignty, which also for countries is considered important as well. In order to consider both the preferences of countries as well as the protection of refugees, and by taking into consideration that the premises of the Tibut argument do not work, the best option is that EU has the competences regarding the minimum standard, in order for the protection of refugees, by leaving to the country the opportunity to compete between each other, but not in by worsening the right or the criteria in order to protect refugees.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
Denard?
Actually, it was finished.
Oh,
Okay. Sorry.
what I find difficult is to understand the argument of the reduction of transaction costs.
Mhm.
I mean, normally the reduction of transaction cost argument would then be that you say, okay, there are now so many different laws between the 28 member states that for people who are using it, the refugees, it would lead to very high transaction costs between them. And that you also assume that if you harmonize it now at the EU level, that leads to an enormous reduction, which also supposes that first of all, you have huge benefits of harmonization, but also that there are no costs of harmonization. You see where I'm a bit puzzled. If we would now today have a completely unified EU law, would that change that much? I mean, is the problem that we're having today that the laws between the countries are so different? Or is it simply a question that even if the laws are completely harmonized, that one country wants to have a lot and the other doesn't? So my problem is a bit, does the harmonization really solve an issue there?
Actually, you are correct. So basically, let me add, when I'm speaking about the transaction cost, obviously this is much more into private law rather than in public law. In order to consider it also to public law, we shall also consider all the social activities. So this is the main premises. So now, going into the merit of the question, the idea is that within the harmonization can be different type of harmonization. Obviously, even when it is spoken about transaction cost, does not mean that having total harmonization will give the same results, because what can mean, because first of all, there are different languages. And obviously, each judge is going to interpret the law, also the EU law, according to their own legal system and their own constitution. So in order to make you a concrete example from private law, what is considered a legal transaction in Germany is not considered a contract in Italy, because in Italy or in French, legal transaction, negotium, does not exist. And therefore, for that reason, it will be quite difficult if, for example, in EU law, there is a written negotium, legal transaction. So the same, this is a concrete example in private law. Or several judges, especially in this moment, can use the cases about refugees for their own career. So basically, if they want to show that they are good, they are going to make a judgment that accept refugees, and they will have a lot of media attention. And so if they want to show that they do not have to accept refugees, they can use these cases for their own career as well. So does not mean, and there are no empirical evidence that by having total harmonization of the law, you are going to achieve the results that EU much emphasized by stating that total EU competence is going to eliminate the transaction cost. So there are no empirical studies because basically, and also for the two arguments that I stated before, this transaction cost, it is not sure if it might work. Now, returning back again, you asked why shall be total harmonization, or shall, in other words, why shall be a total harmonization or leaving the country to compete with each other? And basically that is the minimum standard regime. So basically countries cannot go less than the criteria spoken in EU, but as Germany in 2015 decided, they decided to take more refugees. So now, why they decided it? Because Merkel stated we have, in general, one of my arguments, or one of my analysis is that Merkel stated we have an old population, we need a lot of nurses, and therefore, for that reason, we need young people to work in order to have the pension system for old people. And since in general, refugees have a young age, therefore, for that reason, it's good that we accept more than we are obliged from the EU stated. So basically, what I want to say is that the total harmonization does not give you the possibility to eliminate all the transaction costs, first of all. And second, the total harmonization is not efficient as the minimum harmonization because it gives to the countries the discretionality to choose. Obviously, they cannot choose in worse. So Poland and Hungary tried, and then in 2017, the Court of Justice punished them because it was considered a EU infringement. But they can do in positive, and that was what Germany did. So summing up. Sorry, because
they can finish the answer.
Ah,
Okay.
sorry, I thought that.
no, just summing up. It is not stated that total harmonization is the best solution, and in order to have the possibility to countries to compete with each other, the minimum standardization is the most efficient answer in case of refugees.
Yali is the next, but I just want to
be shorter.
No,
Okay.
to make some order, because you started with an overview of the whole thesis,
Yeah.
and you concentrate in the last part on this particular paper. So I want everybody to be on the same page. From a non-economics perspective, if we analyze asylum law in Europe on the level of the EU and on country level, we have positive questions, okay, positive analysis, which means, we talked about it a little, what is the incentive structure of the refugee, okay, where to go, if to go, and so forth and so on, and what is your prediction of government's policies, okay, under the assumption that they want to avoid refugees, how will they act? This is not what you talked about. You talked actually about pure normative. This chapter is a pure normative analysis of what is the best arrangement.
But not which is the arrangement.
Hmm?
So which is the authority to decide?
Okay, but
not
what
which is
should
the-
be the arrangement on the EU level? And the exact question is whether we want harmonized policy.
Mhm.
What is better? Better, i.e., maximizes the EU welfare or the citizens of the EU welfare or the EU efficiency, various terms. But the question is, what is the most desirable policy? Whether it is total harmonization,
Mhm.
okay, or it is minimum standards from which every country can give more.
Yeah.
And we clarified giving more in terms of both what they give the refugees that they recognize and maybe even who they recognize as refugee. Okay, a broader definition of people who are entitled to refugee status. Okay, and your argument is that counter to Thibault's model, which is a normative model supporting decentralization, okay, supporting basically federation structure, in which every state within the federation or every country within the EU can compete, and that's the best for everyone, because each country will create, or each unit will create the best solutions, and therefore there will be a competition and people can move from one place to another. In contrast to the Thibault analysis, you actually say this doesn't apply in the case of refugees, especially, by the way, because the externality issues, the information issue is not as important here as the externality issue. And the best solution, the normative best solution, the solution which will maximize Europe's welfare, is harmonization of minimum standards, allowing different countries
their own discretion.
Okay, that's a summary of the argument. Yali.
Sorry.
So, thanks. Very interesting. 2 points. One is a follow-up to the last question. Do you suggest that there are no transaction costs for a harmonized regulatory system? Because it seems to me that this is what prevents the EU and the international community more generally from creating more effective refugee system. The fact that we're discussing for 3 decades for better, or that the convention wasn't changed dramatically, suggests that there are huge transaction costs that prevents creating such a harmonized system. So where does it come into your theoretical framework? In my field, asymmetric warfare, the reason that we don't have treaties clearly because the transaction costs are huge. There's no prospect for creating such treaty.
But there is actually a treaty.
There's no binding.
EU, there is no. In the case of refugees, there is EU regulations which are very clear. Enforcement is totally different, but the rules themselves agreed upon.
Yeah.
Sorry.
And my second question is I want to better understand, and it relates to your introduction, is what exactly are the benefits and costs here regarding refugees? If you're analyzing it purely from an economic perspective, if I understand you correctly, the benefit is reputational, mostly.
Are you speaking about?
Because if, for example, from a law and economics perspective, pure law and economics perspective, and you mentioned human rights, and I want to understand more how does it enter your law and economic analysis. So from a pure law and economics understanding, if the benefit of reputation is zero, then the optimal solution is like no refugees at all. And if there are, so when you're talking about minimal harmonization, what is the optimal norms that you think about, and would you accept a zero entry policy as an efficient policy under law and economics analysis of refugee law?
Mhm.
And if not, so I want to hear more. It sounds interesting, so if we're talking about, let's say, from a public law perspective, competition about, I know, criminal law, I
Mhm.
can understand the cost and benefit much better than in the framework of refugees.
Okay. Okay. Let me answer according to not the way that you stated the question, but the way that I have introduced them here. Is fine with you? Okay. So the first one is you stated why the state shall basically comply or not comply, and that is basically this part of the thesis. So when I'm speaking about compliance with the 1951 Convention, I checked how many times the 1951 Convention has been used by the European Court of Human Rights. So that is only 15 times. So there past 50 years, and it's only 15 times. Within this 15 time, within these 15 times, the first violation was done in 1992. Then I focused into two countries, in Italy and in
15
Germany.
times countries were taken to court for
Yeah.
violating the 1951
51 Convention.
Okay.
Yeah, but only in few of them it was considered a violation. Okay, so now then I focus only into Italy and into Greece, because obviously these are the two countries that now have the main refugee flows. And I focus into the economic terms. So let me give you, I don't remember the exact numbers, but more or less these are the numbers. In order to protect one refugee in Italy, it costs you 12,000 euro per year. Now, in order to go in front of the European Court of Human Rights, you have to finish all the administrative proceeding, then all the 3 grades of the national proceeding in Italy, and then you go to the European Court of Human Rights. So it will pass so many times. How many refugees do know that they have so many times, so rights to go to the European Court of Human Rights? So really few of them. And within these few of them, when the court is going to condemn Italy, they're going to decide around 10 or 8,000 euro per person. So now, for me as Italy, it's much better to not comply, because I have to pay 12,000 for each refugee, while it's much better to not comply. Only maybe 0.1% of refugees are going in front of the European Court of Human Rights, and therefore for that reason, I'm going just to pay, after a long of time, just 8,000. But only 1 year I paid 12,000. So it's much better to not comply in economic terms if I am the country. So now the question is why the country shall comply? Because from economic terms, it's much better to not comply, right? Are you following the economic terms? Okay. So now the question is why shall they comply? Because from economic terms, it's much better to not comply. And the answer is basically on what Professor Power stated, on the fact that the protection of refugees is considered negative externalities. In other words, if I know that it's much better to not comply, then the refugees have to go somewhere, and they are going to another country. And this happened in concrete. In 1993, there was the German constitutional modification, which in the German constitution was modified in order to not receive refugees. And all refugees went to France. And then in 1994, France did the same. And then they went in UK. And in 1996, I think, UK did the same. So therefore, as you see, refugees will go somewhere. And this shows that the behavior of one country is going to impact to the other countries. And therefore, for that reason, in order to avoid that countries are going to compete, even because when you change the law, it is costly. Therefore, for that reason, and also for reputation, it's much, for this reason, they are going to comply rather than not to comply, although not complying is economically more advantageous. Okay? So this was about the first question. The second question that you spoke about is again about the transaction cost. So obviously, when you speak about the welfare, does not deal with private law, but still it is into public law, but still you considered the social activities. So basically what you did, you did not consider, because basically when you speak about transaction costs is for multinational companies that have a lot of branches in a lot of countries, and therefore in order to communicate with each other they have problems because they have also to know the law in that particular country. So this comes obviously from private law, but however, if you consider also the social activities, we can also use the transaction cost into the public law. And as I stated, there are no empirical evidence that says also in private law that harmonization, total harmonization, is going to give the results that a supranational authority would like to. So therefore, for that, and also even because judges might be selfish, the total harmonization is not going to give the results that countries wanted. And this is especially important when the spontaneous harmonization does not work.
Then the colleague was making the comment that you also need to take into account the costs of harmonization. You say you look at transaction costs and you say, okay, harmonization may lower transaction costs, but his point is, yes, but wait a moment, also the harmonization process itself may incur very high transaction costs and it may sometimes be inhibitive.
Yeah, definitely. In the moment that there is a total harmonization, of course,
to make, he's talking about the cost to make, to equalize the law, so to make the harmonization, the drafting of the harmonization. He says sometimes it's so difficult that we cannot reach agreement at an international or EU level.
Yes,
that
is true. But at the moment that you reach that agreement, since you are going to suffer from chinkanties, it is quite impossible for you to modify that law, because that happens, for example, when they try to modify it in 2015, and a lot of countries, the East countries, which never had a power, for the first time they had a power, because the East countries stated, we don't want this new regulation, and therefore basically the asylum law did not modify. So obviously there are costs of harmonization, but there are also other costs as well, and you have to choose between the lowest cost possible. However, I will also consider the part of transaction costs, because I see that there are several questions regarding this part, and maybe I was not going into deep in this part because my presumption was that it's more into private law, and therefore for that reason I did not go into details. Then you spoke about which is why I decided to speak about the protection of human rights when I'm trying to have a law and economic approach, right?
Not why, but just
How?
you can explain how it. I can think about ways that it can fit into the benefit side of the analysis or whatever. I just want to understand what's your argument regarding.
Okay, the argument is always about the fair competition. So basically, if I am country A and I give more rights than country B, then basically I spend from my budget more than country B, and therefore for that reason there is not a fair competition between me and the other country. So therefore, for that reason, this is how the human rights protection impacts into the budget. And therefore, for that reason, in order that all countries have the fair competition and they are equal between each other, I also included this argument. So it's always regarding the competition between countries, and in order to not impact, because obviously the refugees impact into the national budget, especially in the short and maybe also in the media time, so in the future. So therefore, for that reason, I also included the protection of human rights. Then the last question is about the minimum harmonization and why the minimum harmonization is more efficient than fixed standard regime. Did I understand correctly? Or
No, I understand. How do you determine the minimum standard in the organization? How exactly do you quantify the reputational benefit of the asylum regulation?
okay, maybe I was not perfectly clear in this part. When I'm speaking about minimum harmonization, is not about the cost benefits of refugees or of the countries. It's just regarding the criteria in order to be qualified as a refugee, or the minimum rights that people that are considered refugees or who have EU protection have in the national country that they are going to be protected. The difference between fixed standard is that EU decides everything and there is no possibility for countries to add in positive or in negative. The minimum standard is that EU decides and country can add, but only in positive side. So they can give more protection, higher protection, or can give more rights. That is basically what I considered in this part of the thesis, minimum harmonization.
You have an example, by the way, of a different arrangement which is fixed and not minimum? Fixed standards? It seems to me that always countries can give more. Is there an example of EU regulation that prevents countries to give more rights than others?
You mean in asylum law or
No, generally.
Product liability is one. European product liability law. In principle, you cannot go beyond what the directive has laid out.
You cannot give more.
No. So there are some cases indeed where they call it's a maximum harmonization. There are some cases like that. Just one comment on Denard. You sometimes say that this is only private law and it doesn't apply to public law. No. The whole story of Thibault and so applies as well to public law.
I'm speaking about only transaction costs.
Why would that not apply to public law?
No. The transaction cost started in private law, but does not. But in the recent decades, has been used also into the public law. I wanted to make this clear. It started in private law because it started from the multi-level companies that had a lot of branches, and but it's also used in public law. Yeah.
May I add something?
Yeah.
I think that the example that you gave earlier is not a proper one, because
Which example? Because
I'm coming to it. If I'm country A and you're country B and we are competing and I'm spending more, it is still competition because the basic conditions are different between A and B. What I mean is that if I suffer from lack of workforce, because of fertility problems, and I want to have more refugees as capital, as human capital in the future. So as a country, I would want to invest. It's an investment. It's not an expenditure from an economic point of view. I'm investing today in order to have the yield tomorrow. So what I'm doing actually, I'm putting a bigger budget, because if you are aware to the solo model of growth, the more I'm investing in human capital, the more growth I will have in the future. It goes together. So this is still a fair competition because the conditions are not levelized between A and B. So what I'm trying to say is that it is still a competition, and what is for me as country A or B, never mind, is how I'm going to see the yield tomorrow, not today. It's an investment. That's what I'm trying to emphasize. It's not an expenditure. Secondly, I think that the problem is not only an economic problem. It is very simple. The article or the paper is very simplified because you have other factors that you cannot ignore, like political risk, like political costs, like sovereign costs. So it's not to take the immigrants like a product, as we do in economics. It's a simplified, version of the problem.
This is what economists.
No. I'm an economist. It's not so. A product is a product, and a refugee is not a product. And by saying this,
is a human resource for the economy.
No. By saying this, we are undermining the concept of human rights. I think so.
Okay.
So it's an oversimplification in this paper to say that immigrants are products, and we have competition, and we should have many suppliers and many clients and full information without externalities, blah blah blah. So this was my comment.
Okay. Thank you.
I don't think you have to answer all of it. I think it would be hard to.
No, I will do it extremely shortly. Regarding the first one, the example, I will answer just with one question. In the case that you stated, expanding now for the future, are you competing in order to receive or to not receive?
To receive.
Therefore, for that reason, it's a fair competition.
I'm ready to invest today.
So therefore, the competition is to not receive. If you are expanding now for the future, the competition is to receive. But until now, there have been a competition to not receive. And therefore, for that reason, this is why the example was correct. Because what I stated was the minimum standard. I did not state the fixed standard. Because if I stated the fixed standard, that the example is wrong. But I stated the minimum standard, and expanding now for the future is what...
It's investing now. It's not expanding. It's investing.
Investing now for the future is basically that.
Okay.
That's the idea.
It really depends on the time spent that you.
Okay.
Okay, and you say it's right to invest in the future, but politicians who want to be re-elected, okay, their consideration is very short term.
Not economic.
Okay.
That's the problem.
Okay.
That's the problem.
Okay.
That's why I'm saying it's a simplification. This theory of Tibet is a very simplification of the problem.
Regarding the second idea, the oversimplification of the paper. Well, actually, I would like to thank you because that was my goal. My goal actually was, since I do not have an economic background, my goal was that to make it extremely easy for someone who does not have an economic background in order to understand a simple question, which is the authority that shall rule, EU or national countries. So, and therefore, for that reason, it was my purpose to make it as easy as possible. Okay. But thank you.
Okay.
Other questions, comments? So I will ask another question.
Okay.
Okay, again about the core argument of competition or harmonization, basically. This is the big debate, right? So the idea of competition, which one version of which is Thibault, is also the race to the bottom. The Delaware example, okay? In the United States, company law is state law. Delaware is the best state, best state for companies, therefore they will register there. Panama flagships, so forth.
For taxes.
And you can say, for example, that in contract law, okay, there is a strong argument for competition, because if Michael and I want to sign a contract and we know that the English contract law is excellent and the courts there are fantastic, we willingly both have an advantage, to sign a clause, to put a clause that every dispute will be disputed by English law, by English courts. Okay? We selected voluntarily because we think it's the best solution for both of us. In case of negligent product liability, it's much more difficult situation because it's not that you can choose where you will be hurt by a Coca-Cola bottle. It can happen to you in your own residence in the Netherlands, or it can happen to you in another EU country. So it's really a matter of luck, and therefore harmonization has an upper hand, and you say even a harmonization without minimum standard, fixed harmonization, because there is no competition, you cannot choose. Okay? How will you employ these two kinds of arguments? Okay? Contract, you can sign voluntarily in any country, therefore we need a competition. Torts, you don't know where you'll be driven over or when a product will cause you harm. So there is a general argument, economic argument for harmonization. How do you put refugees in this setup? Refugee law, I mean.
Yeah.
You know, okay? The product here is refugee law, not refugees.
The protection of refugee through the law. Obviously there are three options when there is a problem between countries. There are three options. It can be complete decentralization, complete centralization, or something in the middle. So, as I stated, in case that there will be complete decentralization, the problem is that there will be several issues regarding the disintegration. And one of the main spirit of the EU is the European integration. And therefore, for that reason, basically is not the option that can be chosen in case of the asylum law. On the other hand, you have the total centralization. So basically, in tort law, when the product liability.
But you dismiss the decentralization option very, very quickly.
Okay. Decentralization.
Every country must stand the standards of international law. Okay.
Of course.
That's a minimum standard that exists outside the EU context. But each country can have its own asylum law according to, for example, its aging population, need for employees, integration history, and so forth. On what's wrong with that from a normative perspective of the EU?
The complete decentralization. The problem is in case of asylum is basically because the protection of refugees is considered externality. So the behavior of one country is going to impact on behavior of others, and this will bring the prisoner dilemma. And therefore, for that reason, this is the main issue why the Thibault argument does not work in case of the refugees. So this is why that's one of the main argument. But the other argument was also the information that there is a deficiency because both countries do not know all the preferences of refugees, and refugees in general, the doctrines say, have no information or little information what is going on in the final destination.
Okay, information is exists the problem of information exists almost in any market, but externalities. If I am Germany and I want to go above the minimum standards because I want to invest in Germany's future, okay, and a politician wants to commit a political suicide in order to invest in the future. It's a very interesting example, okay? I'm talking seriously. Really, I think that the Merkel decision is a very, very admirable decision because it was a rational decision of investment to the future at the expense of her political career. It was already in the end of the program. But what are the negative externalities if Germany wants to give more to the refugees and accept more refugees?
The negative externalities in this case for other countries, I mean, does not exist. Actually, the other country will be happy that Germany is going to take everyone. Okay. So that is for sure. But still, here we are not speaking about.
It's not so. It's not so simple. It's not so simple because if Germany will put a quota on the one hand, and on the other hand, there is a threshold, a normative threshold that was already put in Germany. It may inflict on other countries and put a pressure on the countries to accommodate. It's not so simple. It's not so simple. In other words, if I have a higher standard that I have adopted in Germany, and still Germany can, absorb 1 million, 1.5, 2 million, I don't know exactly. But if at the end of the day, they will say, the Germans, stop, I will not take any more. And by the way, we have this example with Turkey. I can speak about it. The settlement with Turkey is a very good example how the EU tried to settle the problem of Greece by putting 6 billion euro in Turkey in order that they will absorb the immigrants that came to Turkey, to Greece. Okay? So I'm coming back to my argument. If Germany will put a quota and in parallel they have higher standards, this will
lower standards.
No, higher standards. Germany will higher standard,
they give more.
Yes, they give more. That's what I mean.
No, it's high.
They give more.
The terminology is
they give more. Then this can, put pressure on other countries as an externality that the other countries should accommodate. Why Germany yes and I'm no, etc., etc. So it's not so simple. It's very complicated. It's very complicated. We cannot, it's not a static problem. It's a dynamic problem. It evolves all the way. So what is today it's okay, tomorrow it's not okay, etc., etc. It's not something that you put right now and this exists forever. No, this is not the case.
Yeah, of course. But when we can discuss it, it's not a problem. But since I have to write verba volant and scripta rimanes, therefore for that reason, in that moment is that the right. So what I wanted to add is just that Germany, at the moment that accepted refugees, if it's beyond the quota of the EU stated, it's not mandatory that it accepts it under the status of refugee or subsidiary protection, which basically are legally binding. But if Germany wants to accept more, because these two are legally binding, all countries have to accept it. If Germany wants to accept more, of course, it cannot do under the legal definition of refugees, which is international law, or subsidiary protection, which is EU law, but it's going to do into the national law called Duldung. So therefore, for that reason, then these people can go to Germany and stay to Germany and cannot move outside Germany. when they are called duldung, I'm speaking, not when they are called refugee or subsidiary protection. So
Where they're called what?
duldung,
Duldum?
Like really like just temporarily accepted but not acknowledged. It's in between status,
Yeah.
right? And you don't get asylum, but you are not the same status that the infiltrators here would get. You like accepted temporarily.
so therefore, for that reason, other countries will not be threatened, because if they want to, they can have their own category of duldungs, which in Italy is protezione umanitaria. So basically, you should not consider it as a threat for other countries in case that is giving more rights or more quotas to
No,
refugees.
the next sentence should be that if Germany gives refugee status to people, it is of a negative externality to other countries, because once they are considered as refugees, it's not dundum, so they can travel from one country to another. And if, Netherlands doesn't want more people to work in the, so that's exactly is a negative externality.
But international law and European law are legally binding for all the countries.
But
and the definition
you're talking about standards above international
but the
law.
definition of refugees is international law, and all the European countries are bounded by international law and EU law. So if I have the status of subsidiary protection in Germany, I shall have also the status of subsidiary protection also in Netherlands. No? Because it's EU law.
But you were talking about minimum standards that they can go
minimum
above.
standards, if I do duldung, but I do not do subsidiary protection.
It reminds me of the poverty line. The poverty line is something that, is shifting all the way. So this minimum standard is also something that is not a fixed one, that always evolves. So what was minimum today will be maybe minimum tomorrow will be a different minimum. But in any case, I think that if one country through competition gives more than the existing threshold, it may inflict on other countries in a time period.
So I think that the result of our private debate here, and really I want to open it, is that you mean minimum standards not in the criteria for accepting people, recognizing people as refugees, but the bundle of rights and benefits that these people get. Okay, these are, if we talk about minimum standards in the definition of who is entitled to refugee, there is certainly negative externalities because Germany will allow 100 million refugees and then they'll go to Netherlands and so forth. So on. If you talk only about after the people are recognized, it's the same standards, hopefully also enforced, but this we know it's a totally different story, but it's the same standards to grant a person a refugee status. Okay? What you give this person as allowances, classes in language and all this are the extra that you can go beyond, above what the EU law sets. And this doesn't have actually negative externalities. It actually might have positive externalities because those people will be better equipped to the labor market and so forth.
Better integrated.
And better integrated, less crime. So this is, I think, an important correction. Okay, so we talk about minimum standards, not in the term of the qualification to become a refugee, but the benefits that a refugee is getting once he or she is recognized a refugee, right?
Yeah.
By the way, in the 6 billion euros in the Turkish settlement, part of this aid was purported to higher the standard in Turkey, because there were to say, complains that Turkey is exercising a very, very low standard for the refugees. I mean, in the camps, with regard to food, with regard to clothing, with regard to infrastructure, water and so on. So one of the purpose of this, I think it's around 1.5 or 2 billion out of the 6, is to enhance and give a better standard of protection for the refugees.
Mhm.
And this was an initiative from the, what you call in the paper, subsidiarity of the EU. It comes from the top to Turkey. So this is another mean that the European Union induces the
Hiring the threshold.
hiring the threshold of the
Okay.
standard. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, quite interesting. I just wanted to add that because this is due to the fact that Turkey, when has ratified the 1951 Convention, has ratified under the condition for all the refugees before the January 1950. So therefore, for that reason, international law regarding Turkey is not legally binding as the other countries, because it's one of the 5 countries that have ratified it only regarding refugees before January 1st of January.
And it's not part of the EU, of course.
Yeah, no, that is another reason.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Other questions?
Yes.
Okay.
The prisoner dilemma that you have put in the paper,
Okay.
I don't understand the role of the prison dilemma, because it's the opposite. The prison dilemma represents a rational thinking that led to not an optimal
Suboptimal.
video. So what is the intention here to put it in the paper? Do you mean that I have to take non-rational decisions, or rational decisions that are not in the Pareto optimum? What is the intention here? I don't know.
No, Harry, this is unfair. Prison dilemma says that if you are a rational actor and you cannot coordinate with the other actors,
Exactly.
you will get to a suboptimal.
Exactly.
And that's the reason. And the conclusion is that you have to
So, yeah,
coordinate.
Okay, but competition, by definition, is not cooperation.
Right.
It's not
He's
only
using
cooperation.
So but this
And
is his
if
argument,
you-
that it's not competition, but in order to get out of the prisoner's dilemma, we have to cooperate and create
Exactly.
harmonization.
Exactly, but the ultimate goal of this paper is that you are not in a full harmonization or decentralization. You are in the middle.
Right.
Okay. So you are also employing competition with direction from the subsidiarity idea from the EU. So I don't exactly know where the prison dilemma is here. It's not in the competition. It's in the upper stage, in the subsidiarity. I don't know.
When
I think that you can, skip over this prison dilemma.
Okay. Just shortly, when I'm speaking about prison dilemma, it's just in order to say that prison dilemma is one of the main reasons used by EU in order to have total harmonization, and therefore, because cooperation is better than not cooperation, and therefore, for that reason, that is why I used it. But at the moment that we decided that the EU shall be the authority to decide, then we have to check in the second step.
On residual questions, not on the main question. Still, the states, the sovereign states, can compete between themselves,
No.
and they have a major part in this competition. Leave aside the subsidiarity that exists, and it has its role.
Yeah, but at the moment that we decided that the EU shall be the authority, we have to check which is the option which is going to consider also other things, and therefore within the two, then the other one which says cooperation, but in case that
I
you
will
want to.
cooperate with you. Okay.
Great. And I will mention you in the acknowledgement. So.
Michael, why in product liability, what's the rationale of having a ceiling?
There are many domains in European law where they basically say harmonization of marketing conditions is the idea. And so if the member states could still go further, then the harmonization of the marketing conditions is not realized. So there is quite a bit of case law of the EU where member states wanted to go further and where the court systematically said that was not allowed. Because they say that then, of course, you don't have, it's always an internal market argument. So that is a little bit.
Product liability, it's the example. Why should different awards will create incompatible markets or unfair markets?
From an economic perspective, it doesn't make that much sense. But that the whole problem is that in the EU jargon, they don't look really at the economics of federalism. They look at this whole magic word of the internal market. And so the internal market story is any deviation between the member states may lead to distortions of competition. And what we want to do, we want as much as we can to harmonize member state legislation to create a leveling of the playing field for industry. And so their story is
But you don't think that there is a real law and economics rationale in a ceiling for...
I don't think that makes any sense, honestly. I mean, on the other hand, to answer also the comments of the colleague concerning the race to the bottom, I think theoretically, Denard could make an argument. In the sense, suppose you have nothing at all, you have no EU law whatsoever. Then there could be a race to the bottom in the sense that, let's say, Hungary and the Slovak Republic and the Polish, they would all compete to kick everyone out. And that could, from an economic perspective, be considered as a race to the bottom. You see, you don't accept anyone at all. And that may be even a destructive competition that the one gets more nasty than the other. That you say, okay, if you accept that as a race to the bottom, prisoner's dilemma type of story, there may be some argument in favor of a centralization, a European intervention. How far that goes, that's still a different story. And I think that one of the confusions in the debate that we had here, when you talk about harmonization of the actions of the member state law, that we need to think a little bit more about what exactly are you talking about? Are you talking about the contents of the legislation and the level of the standards that are provided to the refugees in the national legislation? Are those differences the problem? Or is the problem in how many quantities, how many refugees are we going to accept, and are they competing or restraining on that? Or is the problem in the procedures? How easy is it? And those are all different steps. And what you also see, as the colleague was rightly saying, we now see totally different preferences between the member states. For example, the Swedes are like you, that they say, welcome, but only the smart ones, and we're going to select. And for them, we open the door. And others, like Hungary and Poland, say, no, none of them, not even the smart ones. And so you see that also in the member states, there are different games that are at this moment being played. And then, of course, I think that's why Denard might want to nuance a little bit, that you cannot generally say that all the member states are generally refusing, because some of them are indeed attracting and are racing, in that sense, maybe to the top, on the condition that they can pick the cherries. That's a bit the issue.
The complicated issue, it's not pure economics, it's political economics.
Oh, yeah, sure.
That's the problem.
I think there we all agree
Yeah.
that the reason for closing the borders in Hungary and so has little to do with rationality and economics, has everything to do with populism and all of that. But then the nice thing is, from an economic perspective, you can think, okay, we see all these things going on. How much differentiation do we allow, taking into account that, to put it bluntly, that the Hungarians are racist and that the Swedes are different? How much differentiation do we allow as a European Union? Are we going to take that into account? That opens interesting questions. Like maybe a differentiation that they say, okay, the Hungarians are allowed to do that on the condition they pay, for example, and that you start the bargaining. And
yeah, the cow is important.
These are interesting questions. Yeah. And so in that sense, you might want to nuance a little bit, let's say, the picture. The problem is, of course, also in your paper, on the one hand, it's theoretically economic. On the other hand, what's going on in Europe is also influencing the whole story. Mm-hmm. And that sometimes the reader thinks, okay, are you now in Europe describing what's going on, or are we in the theoretical world where everything is possible, Mm-hmm. And that...
What about, last question, what about the geographical aspect, which means that some countries are much prone to refugee arrival than others. Okay, those countries without without a sea border, like Hungary, for example, the refugees don't get there anyway because they have to pass through other countries before that.
And of course, the whole externality problem that you talk about.
This is an externality.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, of course, the people who are inland are very much dependent on, for example, what the Italians do.
Mhm.
If the Italians open the border, then you get huge externalities in the direction of Austria, Hungary, and Slovenia.
This is a little bit treated when I'm speaking about the different variables that impact into the decision of refugees.
Yeah, but this is not a question of the decision of the refugee.
But is one of the variables is also the geographical one. So
But for the refugees, what about for
Yeah,
the countries
for the
themselves?
countries.
yeah, of course. If we see, for example, which is the first country who ratified the 1951 convention is Denmark, because Denmark is the country basically knew that no refugees are coming here, and the last country that ratified it were, for example, Baltic countries. While all the Balkans, while all the eastern part ratified it in 1991, maximum 1992. Except Serbia, because it's a little bit particular case. The Baltic countries ratified it only in 1997 because they were afraid of the Russians. And why they ratified it? Because it was a mandatory step in order to be part of the EU in 2004. So the geographic is going to
I'm
impact.
not sure of the example, the Danish example is correct because in
1992,
No,
1952, sorry.
1936-39, the refugees, Jewish refugees from Germany came to Denmark. It was one of the closest places to come to.
Yeah, but
yeah, I know that this is before the refugee convention, but it's not that they're naturally not prone to refugee. You know, if there would be refugees from Europe, from Germany, from France.
Yeah, I thought Germany actually and Scandinavian countries. I did not think about actually Jewish. But I think that
you don't know where the refugees will come from in the next round.
Yeah.
That's the.
Yeah.
No, but you can say that inland countries, that are surrounded by other European countries, these are the countries to which the refugees will never come first unless they come by air.
Yeah. And you know, Eli, this is a consequence of this very strange Dublin regulation. The Dublin regulation says that the refugees are the responsibility of, so to say, the country of first entry.
Application. Yeah.
So that means that all these countries and so in a way the inland countries negotiated that and put that on, let's say, on the PIGS, Portugal, Italy, Greece, and Spain. So they get all the first entry. Then, of course, the incentive of the PIGS is to their borders. They say, I mean, we get millions of these guys coming from Africa. You're very good. And that, of course, is a system in the long run that will change. This Dublin regulation leads to perverse incentives on the side of the southern countries not to control the borders anymore. At least that's what you see nowadays, of course. And then the Austrians get angry and they start closing their borders in violation of Schengen or ask for exceptions and so on.
They try to modify Dublin 3 in order to make Dublin 4, but still.
Nice topic, Denard.
Merci.
Thank you very much.